The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Windsor Castle, as 10-year-old Prince George walked quietly beside his grandfather, King Charles. The young prince had always been fascinated by the ceremonial guards who stood motionless for hours, their red tunics pristine, and their tall black hats perfectly positioned. Today was different, though. George had asked specifically to visit the guards during their morning duty, something that surprised even his royal protection officers. As they approached the main courtyard, George noticed something that made him pause. One of the guards, a tall man with kind eyes visible beneath his bearskin hat, seemed to be struggling. The guard's face was pale and tiny beads of sweat formed on his forehead despite the cool morning air. George had learned about duty and service from his parents and grandparents, but he had never seen someone push through such obvious discomfort while maintaining their post. The guard's name was James Morrison, though George didn't know this yet. James had been serving in the Queen's Guard for 8 years, and today marked a particularly challenging day for him. His wife Sarah had given birth to their first child just 12 hours earlier, but complications during delivery had left both mother and baby in the hospital. James had tried to get leave, but with several guards already out sick, he couldn't abandon his post. The weight of worry pressed down on him heavier than his ceremonial uniform. George watched James with growing concern. The young prince had inherited his mother's empathetic nature and his father's keen observation skills. He could see that this wasn't just about standing still or being tired. Something deeper was troubling the guard, and George felt compelled to understand what it was. His grandfather noticed the boy's intense focus and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. The morning ceremony was about to begin, with tourists and photographers gathering to witness the famous changing of the guard. James stood at his position near the castle entrance, fighting back waves of anxiety about his family. He had received only one brief text from his mother-in-law that morning, still waiting for news. Doctors are optimistic. It wasn't enough information for a worried new father, but it was all he had. George observed how James maintained his composure despite his obvious distress. The guard's discipline was remarkable, but the young prince could see the human being beneath the uniform. This wasn't just a ceremonial figure or a tourist attraction. This was a real person with real problems, someone who was choosing duty over personal comfort in a way that George was beginning to understand on a deeper level. As the crowd gathered and cameras began clicking, George made a decision that would surprise everyone present. He stepped forward, moving away from his grandfather's protective presence and walking directly toward James. The royal protection officers tensed, ready to intervene, but King Charles raised his hand slightly, curious to see what his grandson intended to do. The courtyard fell silent as people realized that Prince George was approaching one of the guards. This wasn't part of any planned ceremony or photo opportunity. This was something entirely spontaneous, driven by a 10-year-old's instinct to help someone in need. James remained at attention, but his eyes flickered with surprise as the young prince came closer. George stopped directly in front of James and looked up at him with serious, compassionate eyes. The guard maintained his formal position, but something passed between them in that moment. It was a connection that transcended royal protocol and military discipline. It was simply one human being recognizing another's pain and choosing to respond with kindness. The cameras captured every moment, but nobody yet understood the significance of what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a cute interaction between a royal child and a guard. This was the beginning of something that would demonstrate the true power of empathy and the profound impact that simple human kindness can have, even in the most formal and structured environments. James felt something shift inside him as he looked down at the serious young face before him. Despite his training to remain emotionless and still, he found himself deeply moved by the genuine concern he saw in Prince George's eyes. The boy seemed to understand, without words, that something was wrong, and his presence offered a comfort that James hadn't expected to find during his duty. The morning air seemed to hold its breath as everyone waited to see what would happen next. George stood perfectly still, mirroring the guard's posture in a gesture of respect and solidarity. It was as if the young prince was saying, without words, that he saw James not just as a ceremonial figure, but as a person deserving of recognition and support. For several long minutes, Prince George stood motionless before Guard James Morrison, creating an unusual tableau that captivated everyone present. The young prince had positioned himself in a stance of respect, his small hands clasped behind his back, mirroring the formal posture he had observed in countless royal ceremonies. But this wasn't about copying protocol. This was about showing solidarity with someone who was clearly struggling. James felt his chest tighten with emotion as he realized what the boy was doing. In his 8 years of service, he had stood through rain, snow, blazing heat, and bitter cold. He had maintained his post while dealing with rude tourists, crying children, and countless distractions. But nothing had prepared him for this moment of pure, innocent compassion from a 10-year-old prince who seemed to understand his pain without knowing its source. The crowd of tourists began to murmur among themselves, phones and cameras capturing this unexpected scene. Royal photographers, initially confused by the departure from planned activities, quickly recognized they were witnessing something extraordinary. The usual chatter and movement of the morning ceremony had given way to an almost sacred silence, as if everyone present sensed the gravity of what was unfolding. King Charles watched his grandson with a mixture of pride and amazement. He had always known George was a thoughtful child, but this demonstration of intuitive empathy impressed him deeply. The king remembered his own childhood lessons about duty and service, but he had rarely seen such natural compassion displayed so publicly and spontaneously. His grandson was teaching him something about leadership that couldn't be found in any royal handbook. James's mind wandered briefly to the hospital where his wife Sarah lay recovering. The doctors had assured him that both she and their newborn daughter were stable, but complications during the delivery had required emergency surgery. As a new father, every instinct told him he should be there, holding his wife's hand and marveling at their miracle baby. Instead, duty had called him to this post, and he had answered as he always did. The young prince seemed to sense the guard's internal struggle. George had learned from his parents about the sacrifices that people in service make for their country and their duty. He had heard stories of soldiers missing family celebrations, police officers working through holidays, and firefighters leaving their own families to help others. Now, standing before James, he was witnessing this sacrifice firsthand. Without breaking his formal stance, George began to speak in a soft but clear voice that carried across the silent courtyard. "My mother told me that the bravest people are those who do their duty even when their hearts are somewhere else," he said, his young voice filled with wisdom beyond his years. "She said that real courage isn't about not being scared or worried. It's about doing what's right even when you want to be somewhere else." James felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, but his training kept them from falling. The prince's words hit him with unexpected force because they captured exactly what he was feeling. His heart was indeed somewhere else in a hospital room with his family, but his duty kept him here. To hear this acknowledged by a child, and not just any child but a member of the royal family, touched something deep within him. The crowd had grown larger as word spread through the castle grounds that something unusual was happening. Royal staff members, other guards, and visitors all gathered at a respectful distance, creating a human circle around the prince and the guard. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant sounds of London traffic and the occasional click of a camera shutter. George continued to stand in perfect stillness, and gradually something remarkable began to happen. Other visitors started to follow his example, standing quietly and respectfully instead of chattering and taking photos. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves, asking to stand like the prince. Adults put away their phones and simply observed this powerful demonstration of respect and empathy. The young prince's gesture was having a ripple effect that no one had anticipated. What had begun as one child's response to another person's distress was becoming a collective moment of shared humanity. The formal barriers between royalty and subjects, between guards and civilians, seemed to dissolve in the face of this simple act of compassion. James realized that something profound was happening, not just to him, but around him. The usual chaos and noise of a tourist attraction had been replaced by something that felt almost ceremonial in its dignity. People were experiencing the true meaning behind the traditions and protocols they had come to observe. They were witnessing duty, sacrifice, and honor in their purest forms. As the minutes passed, George's silent vigil continued. He showed no signs of restlessness or distraction, despite his young age. His commitment to this moment of solidarity was absolute, demonstrating a maturity and depth of character that impressed everyone present. The young prince was learning in real time about the weight of leadership and the power of compassionate action. As the silent standoff continued, Prince George began to notice subtle details about guard James Morrison that others might have missed. The way James's breathing was slightly irregular, how his usually perfect posture showed tiny signs of tension, and most importantly, the look in his eyes that spoke of worry far beyond anything related to his ceremonial duties. George had inherited his mother's ability to read people's emotions, and every instinct told him that this man was carrying a heavy burden. The young prince had grown up surrounded by people who served others, from palace staff to security officers to his own family members, who dedicated their lives to public service. He understood even at his age that service often required personal sacrifice. But standing here, witnessing James's struggle firsthand, made this abstract concept suddenly very real and very personal. James found himself fighting an internal battle between his professional training and his human emotions. The presence of the young prince had created an unexpected crack in his carefully maintained composure. He had been taught to be invisible, to be a living statue that tourists could photograph but never truly connect with. Yet here was this child, seeing him not as a uniform or a tradition, but as a person with feelings and concerns. The crowd around them had grown to nearly 100 people, all drawn by the unusual scene unfolding before them. Tour guides had stopped their planned routes, parents had lifted children onto their shoulders for a better view, and even other guards had turned their heads slightly to observe what was happening. The normal schedule of ceremonies and activities seemed suspended in favor of this spontaneous moment of human connection. King Charles stepped closer, but remained at a respectful distance. He could see that his grandson was engaged in something important, something that couldn't be rushed or interrupted. The king had spent decades learning about the delicate balance between royal duty and personal compassion, and he recognized that George was navigating this same territory with remarkable intuition. After nearly 15 minutes of silent solidarity, Prince George made another unexpected move. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, carefully folded piece of paper. It was a note he had written that morning, originally intended for his grandfather, but something told him it belonged with James instead. The paper contained a simple drawing of a guard standing tall, with the words, "Thank you for keeping us safe," written in George's careful handwriting. The young prince held the note out toward James, who was unable to accept it without breaking protocol. Understanding this, George gently placed the paper at James's feet, positioning it carefully so that it wouldn't blow away in the morning breeze. The gesture was small but profound, a tangible token of appreciation that acknowledged James's service and sacrifice. James looked down at the note and felt his resolve finally begin to crack. The simple drawing and heartfelt message from this young prince represented something he had never expected to receive during his years of service. It was recognition not just of his role, but of his humanity. The fact that it came from a child made it even more powerful, because children see truth in its purest form, without the complications that adults often add. The crowd seemed to collectively hold its breath as they witnessed this exchange. Many people began to understand that they were seeing something historically significant, not because of any grand ceremony or official announcement, but because of the genuine human connection being displayed before them. Cameras captured every moment, but the real impact was happening in the hearts and minds of those present. George stepped back to his original position and resumed his silent vigil, but now there was a different quality to his presence. He had moved beyond simple solidarity to active support. The note at James's feet served as a bridge between them, a physical representation of the emotional connection that had formed. The young prince's actions were demonstrating a level of emotional intelligence and leadership that many adults struggle to achieve. As word of the scene spread through social media and news outlets, people around the world began to follow the story. The image of a young prince standing in solidarity with a struggling guard resonated with anyone who had ever felt the tension between duty and personal concerns. It reminded viewers that behind every uniform, every job title, and every role, there is a human being with hopes, fears, and responsibilities. James felt something shift within him as he absorbed the full impact of Prince George's gesture. The worry about his wife and newborn daughter didn't disappear, but it was now accompanied by a sense of being truly seen and valued. The young prince had given him something invaluable, the recognition that his sacrifice mattered, not just to the institution he served, but to the people he protected. The morning sun had climbed higher in the sky, and the usual tourist activities were beginning to resume around them, but the space immediately surrounding George and James remained sacred. Other visitors had begun to approach more quietly with greater respect, as if they understood that they were in the presence of something significant. Prince George's feet were beginning to ache from standing still for so long, but he showed no signs of wanting to leave. His commitment to this moment had become absolute, and everyone present could sense his determination to see it through to its natural conclusion. The young prince was learning that true leadership sometimes means staying present during difficult moments, offering support through action rather than words. After nearly 30 minutes of standing together in silent solidarity, something unexpected happened that would change everything. James's phone, tucked discreetly in his uniform pocket, vibrated with an incoming message. According to strict protocol, guards were never supposed to check their phones during duty, but the vibration reminded him of why his heart was so heavy. His wife Sarah had been scheduled for additional tests that morning, and he had been desperately waiting for news. Prince George, with his keen observational skills, noticed the almost imperceptible change in James's expression when the phone buzzed. The guard's already pale face seemed to grow even whiter, and his breathing became more labored. The young prince realized that whatever was troubling this man had just intensified, and his protective instincts kicked in even stronger. Without warning, James began to sway slightly on his feet. The combination of emotional stress, lack of sleep, and the physical demands of standing at attention for hours was finally taking its toll. His vision blurred momentarily, and he fought desperately to maintain his composure. The last thing he wanted was to embarrass himself or the guard in front of so many people, especially with Prince George standing right there. The young prince immediately recognized the signs of distress. He had seen similar moments during formal events when adults pushed themselves beyond their limits. His grandfather had taught him that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is ask for help. And George could see that James was at that critical point, but was too proud or too bound by duty to seek assistance. King Charles, who had been observing from a distance, also noticed James's deteriorating condition. The king's years of experience with formal ceremonies had taught him to recognize when someone was struggling. He began to move closer, ready to intervene if necessary, but he paused when he saw what his grandson was about to do. Prince George made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He stepped directly in front of James and looked up at him with an expression of deep concern. "Sir," he said softly, using the formal address his parents had taught him, "I think you need to sit down. There's no shame in taking care of yourself." The words hit James like a physical blow, not because they were harsh, but because they were exactly what he needed to hear. This 10-year-old prince was giving him permission to be human, to acknowledge his struggles and to accept help. The rigid walls of protocol and duty that had been holding him upright suddenly felt less important than the genuine care being offered by this remarkable child. James looked down at Prince George and felt his carefully maintained composure finally begin to crack. Tears that he had been holding back for hours started to form in his eyes, and his voice was barely a whisper when he spoke. "Your Highness," he managed to say, "my wife just had our first baby, but there were complications. I don't know if they're okay." The admission hung in the air between them, raw and vulnerable. James had just broken one of the most fundamental rules of his position by speaking while on duty and sharing personal information. But in that moment, faced with the genuine compassion of this young prince, the rules seemed less important than the human connection they had forged. Prince George's eyes widened with understanding and sympathy. He had heard about babies being born from his own siblings' arrivals, and he knew it was supposed to be a happy time. The fact that this guard was worried instead of celebrating made perfect sense of everything George had observed. "That's why you're sad," the prince said simply. "You want to be with them." The crowd around them had been listening intently, and many people felt their own eyes filling with tears as they witnessed this moment of vulnerability and compassion. What had started as a tourist attraction had become something deeply human and moving. People were seeing past the pageantry and protocol to the real people underneath. James nodded, unable to speak as emotion overwhelmed him. The physical strain of maintaining his post while carrying such emotional weight had pushed him to his breaking point. The kindness of this young prince had created a safe space for him to finally acknowledge what he was going through, and the relief was overwhelming. King Charles approached slowly, his own eyes showing deep emotion. He had watched his grandson demonstrate a level of emotional intelligence and leadership that impressed him beyond words. George had instinctively understood what was needed and had provided it without hesitation, showing compassion that transcended age, rank, and protocol. "James," the king said gently, using the guard's first name for the first time anyone could remember, "you should be with your family. That's where you belong right now." The king's words carried the weight of royal authority, but they were delivered with the warmth of one father speaking to another. Prince George reached out and gently touched James's arm, a gesture that would normally be unthinkable given royal protocol. "Go be with your baby," he said with the simple wisdom that children possess. "We'll be okay here. Your family needs you more than we do right now." The barriers between royalty and subject, between duty and humanity, between formality and genuine care, all seemed to dissolve in that moment. James looked from the young prince to the king, seeing not just royal figures but fellow human beings who understood the importance of family and were encouraging him to prioritize what truly mattered. James Morrison stood frozen in a moment that would define not just his day, but potentially his entire understanding of duty, service, and humanity. The young prince's words echoed in his mind, "Go be with your baby." Such simple words from a child, yet they carried more weight than any military order he had ever received. The permission to choose family over duty, coming from the very people he was sworn to protect, created an emotional storm within him. Prince George maintained his position directly in front of James, creating a shield of compassion around the struggling guard. The young prince understood with the clarity that children often possess that sometimes rules need to bend for human needs. He had watched his own parents navigate the balance between royal duties and family responsibilities, and he recognized that this was one of those crucial moments when humanity had to take precedence. The crowd had grown completely silent, sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Tourists who had come expecting a routine ceremony found themselves moved to tears by this display of genuine human connection. Many pulled out their phones not to take pictures for social media, but to record something they knew their friends and family would find deeply meaningful. King Charles stepped closer to James, his presence both authoritative and paternal. "James," he said quietly, "in all my years of service I've learned that the greatest duty we can perform is to be present for our families when they need us most. Your wife and daughter need you now. The guard will manage without you today." James felt his knees weaken as the full permission to leave his post sank in. For 8 years, he had never abandoned his duty, never put personal needs before service requirements. The idea of walking away from his position went against every instinct that military training had instilled in him. Yet here were the very people he served, not just permitting but encouraging him to choose his family. Prince George reached into his other pocket and pulled out his phone, a device he was rarely allowed to use in public. "Here," he said, offering it to James, "call the hospital. Find out how they are. You shouldn't have to worry when you could know for sure." The gesture was so unexpected and generous that James felt his carefully constructed composure finally shatter completely. Tears began to flow freely down his cheeks as he accepted the phone from the young prince. The sight of a member of the Queen's Guard crying while on duty should have been scandalous. But instead, it felt profoundly human and relatable to everyone watching. With trembling fingers, James dialed the hospital number he had memorized. The crowd waited in respectful silence as he spoke quietly to someone on the other end. Prince George stood protectively beside him, as if the 10-year-old understood that this phone call would determine everything that happened next. "Sarah?" James's voice cracked as he spoke to his wife for the first time since leaving for duty that morning. "How are you? How's our baby?" The conversation was brief but life-changing. Sarah's voice, weak but happy, told him that both she and their daughter Emily were doing well. The complications had been resolved, and the doctors were optimistic about their complete recovery. James handed the phone back to Prince George with hands that shook with relief, rather than worry. "They're okay," he whispered, and then louder, "They're both okay." The smile that spread across his face was radiant, transforming him from a struggling guard into a joyful new father in an instant. Prince George's own face lit up with happiness. "That's wonderful," he exclaimed with genuine excitement. "You're a daddy now." That's the most important job in the world. The young prince's joy was infectious, and several people in the crowd began to clap spontaneously, celebrating this stranger's good news as if it were their own. King Charles placed a gentle hand on James's shoulder. "Congratulations, James. Now go meet your daughter properly. That's an order from your king." The authority in his voice made it clear that this wasn't a request or a suggestion. James was being officially relieved of duty so he could be where he belonged. James began to remove his ceremonial bearskin hat, the first step in the process of leaving his post. As he did, something unprecedented happened. Prince George stepped forward and, with the utmost care and respect, helped steady the heavy hat as James lifted it from his head. The young prince treated the ceremonial item with the reverence it deserved, understanding its significance while also recognizing that the man wearing it was more important than the uniform itself. Other guards, who had been watching from their positions, began to subtly adjust their stance in a gesture of respect for their colleague. They understood the magnitude of what was happening and wanted to honor both James's years of faithful service and his transition into fatherhood. The moment felt ceremonial in a way that transcended any official protocol. As James prepared to leave his post, he looked down at Prince George with an expression of gratitude that words couldn't capture. "Thank you, Your Highness," he said simply. "You've taught me something important today about what real service means." Prince George smiled up at him with the wisdom and warmth that had already touched so many people that morning. "You taught me something too," the young prince replied. "You showed me what it looks like to keep going even when your heart is somewhere else. That's real courage." The exchange between the 10-year-old prince and the new father had created something beautiful and lasting. James would go on to meet his daughter and support his recovering wife, but he would carry with him the memory of a young royal who saw his humanity and responded with pure compassion. What happened next would be remembered as one of the most touching moments in the modern history of the British Royal Guard. As James Morrison prepared to leave his post to meet his newborn daughter, he did something that had never been done before in the centuries-old tradition of the Queen's Guard. He turned to face Prince George directly and, with slow, deliberate movements that spoke of deep respect and gratitude, he performed a formal bow. This wasn't the brief nod that protocol might have required. This was a full, respectful bow that acknowledged not just Prince George's royal status, but the extraordinary compassion and wisdom the young prince had shown. James held the position for several long seconds, and in that gesture, he conveyed everything he couldn't put into words about what the morning had meant to him. Prince George, understanding the significance of the moment, returned the bow with equal formality and respect. The 10-year-old had learned about ceremonial gestures from countless royal events, but this exchange felt different. This wasn't about protocol or tradition. This was about two human beings acknowledging the connection they had forged and the impact they had made on each other's lives. The crowd watched in absolute silence as this unprecedented exchange took place. Many people were crying openly, moved by the pure humanity of what they were witnessing. Cameras captured every moment, but the real magic was happening in the hearts of those present, who understood they were seeing something that would be talked about for generations. As James straightened from his bow, he began the process of formally stepping down from his post. With Prince George standing nearby like an honor guard, James carefully removed his red tunic, revealing the simple white shirt underneath. Each piece of ceremonial uniform was handled with reverence, both by James and by the young prince who helped where appropriate. King Charles had summoned another guard to take James's position, ensuring that the ceremonial duties would continue uninterrupted. But for these few minutes, the focus was entirely on the transition taking place. James folded his uniform with the same precision he had maintained throughout his years of service, but now there was joy in his movements rather than the weight of worry. Prince George watched every step of the process with fascination and respect. He was learning firsthand about the dedication required to serve in the Royal Guard, and also about the importance of knowing when service to family must take precedence over other duties. The young prince was receiving an education in leadership and compassion that no classroom could provide. As James prepared to leave, he picked up the note that Prince George had placed at his feet earlier. The simple drawing and message of thanks had taken on even greater significance during their time together. James carefully folded the paper and placed it in his wallet, a keepsake he would treasure forever. "Your Highness," James said to Prince George, I want you to know that what you did today changed everything for me. You saw me when I needed to be seen and you cared when I needed someone to care. That's what real leadership looks like. Prince George's response demonstrated wisdom far beyond his years. My mom says that we're all just people trying to do our best, he replied. Sometimes the best thing we can do is help each other remember what's really important. Today your family was what was really important. The crowd had begun to disperse slightly, but many people remained to witness the conclusion of this remarkable morning. Tour guides were already incorporating the story into their narratives, recognizing that they had witnessed something that would become part of Windsor Castle's living history. James's replacement guard arrived and took position with professional efficiency, but even he seemed moved by what had transpired. The new guard nodded respectfully to both James and Prince George, acknowledging the extraordinary circumstances that had led to this changing of the guard. As James gathered his personal belongings and prepared for his journey to the hospital, Prince George made one final gesture that surprised everyone. The young prince approached the new guard and repeated his earlier action, standing silently beside him in a gesture of respect and solidarity. It was clear that George had learned something profound about the nature of service and wanted to honor all those who dedicate themselves to protecting others. King Charles watched his grandson with immense pride. In one morning, George had demonstrated empathy, wisdom, courage, and leadership in ways that would have impressed seasoned diplomats. The king realized that his grandson had inherited not just royal blood, but the deeper qualities that make truly great leaders. James Morrison shook hands with King Charles, received another warm smile from Prince George, and began his walk toward the castle exit. But he didn't walk alone. Several members of the crowd, touched by his story and Prince George's compassion, offered him rides to the hospital, congratulations on his new daughter, and expressions of gratitude for his years of service. The morning that had begun with worry and duty was ending with joy and human connection. James's story had become everyone's story, a reminder that behind every uniform, every role, and every responsibility, there are real people with real lives that matter deeply. As James disappeared from view, heading toward his new role as a father, Prince George remained standing beside the new guard. The young prince had started something that morning that he wasn't ready to finish. His silent vigil had become a statement about respect, service, and the importance of seeing the humanity in everyone around us. 3 hours later, James Morrison held his daughter Emily for the first time, his heart overflowing with gratitude not just for his healthy family, but for the 10-year-old prince who had made this moment possible. As he looked down at his sleeping daughter, he whispered to her about the young royal, who had shown such extraordinary compassion to a stranger in uniform. Emily would grow up hearing this story, learning from her father's experience about the power of kindness and the importance of seeing beyond appearances to the human heart beneath. Meanwhile, back at Windsor Castle, Prince George's actions had created ripple effects that no one could have anticipated. The story had spread rapidly through social media, news outlets, and word of mouth. Videos of the young prince standing in solidarity with the distressed guard had been viewed millions of times, touching hearts around the world. But the real impact was happening right there in the castle courtyard, where George continued his silent vigil with the replacement guard. The new guard, Sergeant Michael Davies, found himself deeply moved by the prince's continued presence. Having heard what had transpired with James, Michael understood that he was experiencing something unprecedented. The young prince wasn't just observing the ceremony, he was participating in it, showing respect for the institution, while also honoring the individuals who served within it. Word of Prince George's actions reached other members of the royal family throughout the day. His parents, Prince William and Princess Catherine, felt immense pride in their son's demonstration of empathy and leadership. They had worked hard to raise their children with an understanding of their privileged position and the responsibility that came with it. George's spontaneous act of compassion showed that these lessons had taken root in a profound way. Queen Camilla, upon hearing the story, was moved to tears. She had watched Prince George grow from a small child into a thoughtful young person, but this morning's events revealed depths of character that impressed even those who knew him best. The young prince had instinctively understood that true nobility comes not from titles or positions, but from how we treat others in their moments of need. As the day progressed, Other guards throughout the palace began to share their own stories of personal struggles and family concerns. Prince George's actions had created a safe space for these dedicated servants to be seen as whole human beings rather than just uniformed figures. The atmosphere around the castle had shifted in subtle but meaningful ways, with greater understanding and respect flowing between the royal family and those who served them. The international response to the story was overwhelming. Letters, emails, and social media messages poured in from around the world, praising Prince George's compassion and sharing similar stories of ordinary people showing extraordinary kindness. Teachers used the story in classrooms to discuss empathy and leadership. Therapists referenced it when helping clients understand the importance of human connection. Military families found comfort in seeing their own sacrifices acknowledged and honored. James Morrison's story, too, had captured global attention. He received thousands of messages of congratulations on his daughter's birth and gratitude for his years of service. A scholarship fund was established in Emily's name to support the children of military families. James himself became a sought-after speaker, sharing his experience and the lessons he learned about the balance between duty and family, though he always made sure to emphasize that the real hero of the story was the young prince who had seen his humanity. Several months later, Prince George received an invitation to visit James's family at their home. The prince eagerly accepted, and the reunion was filled with joy and laughter. Emily, now a healthy, happy baby, seemed to smile especially brightly when George held her. James's wife, Sarah, thanked the prince repeatedly for ensuring that her husband was present during those crucial early days of their daughter's life. During that visit, James presented Prince George with a special gift, a handmade wooden guardsman figure that he had carved himself. The figure stood in the traditional at-attention pose, but its face was carved with a gentle smile, representing the humanity that exists within the formality of service. George treasured the gift, keeping it on his bedroom shelf as a reminder of the day he learned that true leadership sometimes means helping others find their way to what matters most. The story of Prince George and Guard James Morrison became part of royal history, but more importantly, it became a testament to the power of compassion to transcend barriers and create meaningful change. The young prince had demonstrated that age, position, and protocol need never prevent us from reaching out to help another human being in need. Years later, as Prince George grew into his role as a future king, he would often reflect on that morning at Windsor Castle. The experience had taught him that the most important crown a leader can wear is one of humility and empathy. The lesson he learned from Guard James Morrison, that real courage means continuing to serve even when your heart is elsewhere, became a guiding principle in his own approach to royal duty. The legacy of that extraordinary morning lived on in the countless acts of kindness it inspired, in the conversations it started about the humanity of those who serve, and in the reminder it provided that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply stand with someone who needs to know they are not alone. Prince George's silent but powerful act had moved not just one guard, but an entire world, proving that compassion knows no boundaries and that even the smallest gestures can create the greatest change.